Hello and welcome to the introduction to policy in pandemic. I'm Yazad Jal, the director of CCS Academy at the Center for Civil Society. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Parth Shah, the founder of the Center for Civil Society and the co-founder and director of the Indian School of Public Policy. Parth has had now more than 30 years experience in economics and public policy. And he's one of the leading public policy experts in areas like education in India. So without much ado, let me go ahead and hand this over to Parth, who's going to talk on COVID-19 and what its implications are for public policy. Thank you.
Welcome to the two-day virtual conference on pandemic and policy. This is a great, I think very timely and productive collaboration between Center for Civil Society and the Student for Liberty South Asia. Looking at the roster of speakers that we have, I'm really very excited to hear them. It would have been impossible to put together this conference actually before the current pandemic that we are facing. Yes, in theory, we could have done this kind of a conference, say a year ago, but most people would have found quite odd, particularly speakers as well as the audience sitting in their own homes and participating in such a conference. But now it is sort of daily life. So I see this is sort of a new sort of wave of globalization of conversation. We of course had Twitter and Facebook, which were global means of conversation. But now this is becoming like a long form. They were short form conversation. This is a long form conversation that we are now going to have. Right? And that's the thing, to me, looks like a new way of conversing, new way of engaging with people around the globe. And this may be one of the positive sort of aspects of the current pandemic. I was just thinking that if you had a good transcription software, which can understand these multiple accents and sentence structures simultaneously and transcribe what we are saying here at the conference, you would have a sort of transcript available immediately after the conference. Or along with it possibly. And if you add a sort of smart editor to it, maybe an AI editor that understands the difference between sort of spoken communication and written communication and can edit the document accordingly, you could see that at the end of it, we would have an edited volume of what people have presented in this conference. Right? You can see that this medium would allow us to have video available for the conference. Obviously, you can do an audio podcast for the conference and a text form properly edited, available as an edited volume possibly at the end of the conference, which is actually seems like a very marvelous thing in terms of the power of communication that this new approach allows. So I'm very excited. I'm particularly excited about the speakers that we have. I know Tyler Cowan has come to India before. We have been able to bring him here. But David Kelly, George Selgin, for example, it would have been impossible to think of them coming to India or South Asia. But now we are going to benefit from their global understanding and insight in how we think about this pandemic. On the other hand, we have people from Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, which would have been impossible to do physical conference of this kind either in India or Pakistan with other Indian or Pakistani participants. So I'm very excited about this particular medium, and obviously the first great collaboration between Center for Civil Society and the Students for Liberty South Asia. I'm going to say a few things about the pandemic. I should say that I don't really have any strong sort of opinions on this matter. I'm going to make a few observations that I think would be of interest as a way to kick off this dialogue. And as I say in the title, I'm sure you can see the PowerPoint that I'm going to be using. It's a very short few slides. So I'm calling this is my presentation as an armchair in the times of COVID. It is really armchair theorizing or expertising. I don't even know the right word, armchairing. But that's in a sense what I feel I'm doing in this situation. In more than once, of course, personally, I'm armchairing. I don't have any idea of what's going on much, even in Delhi, let alone in India, other than what we hear from others. And obviously, there's a system-wide armchairing. Most people in the system do not really know as much as they would like to know about what's going on the ground. So it is really armchairing. I know I'm particularly sort of careful about making any predictions or making any recommendations about what should be done. One reason for that is also I have background in pharmacy. My first degree was in pharmacy and the second one in economics. So I understand virology to some extent, what this means to research and figure out what the virus is doing. And we don't really know much about this particular virus, which is why it's called the novel virus. That gives me a big pause, but as I said, I'll share with you a few of the observations. The first one is that this is a pandemic of experts. I mean, everything that we are doing is largely driven by the experts, and experts, those who make worst predictions and are loudest, are the ones who are getting attention of the public as well as the political leaders. They are driving much of the agenda. Also, they are not just getting attention of the leaders, but also they are directly communicating with the public. This is the new mode of communication that we have. So public is also getting informed about these predictions which are made by the experts. And that has created a sort of new dynamic for the public leaders. Right? So they have to respond to this public demand and act now. What that means is there's less and less time to be informed, to be reasoned and make balanced decisions. And I think that is one of the biggest challenge I see in terms of the current global way of engaging with the pandemic at the epistemic level in some sense. We call this war on the virus, and one war analogy that I can remember is the Second World War. And if you think about how the leaders in US or Great Britain or even Soviet Union on one side made decisions, it was very different environment. They had time to reflect. They had experts who can give them opinion. They had time to also balance their decisions about various impact and differential impact it would have on different industries or different groups of people. All of that was possible to do because nobody publicly discussed about the impact of atomic bomb. And public had no idea at the time what would that mean. So that did allow, in some sense, to have a more informed, reasoned, and balanced decision, which I think today is not. And I think our leaders are not prepared, unfortunately, to deal in such an now environment that they are in. And I think that's why you see also quite a bit of oscillation and pendulum swinging from one end to the other. One example of the debate is lives versus livelihoods. And that debate highlights this immediate action the leaders have to take. Right? So you see Trump in the US in the beginning saying this pandemic, this Wuhan virus, of course he called it a Chinese virus, is similar to a flu, and there's nothing much to worry about. It slowly will pass away. Then suddenly realized the severity of the action and began to talk about what grave threat that the US is facing because of the Wuhan virus. And now, having seen the impact of the lockdown and shelter-in-place policies, he's already talking about the other extreme of opening up the US and particularly the economic part of the US. And so I see that this pendulum swinging from one extreme to the other is also a result of the new mode of communication that we are part of. And the debate between lives and livelihoods sort of exemplifies that, which also doesn't allow us to make distinctions between developing societies and developed countries. Right? We know that in most such situations, the responses are generally different in these two types of societies. But it's very difficult to justify for a leader of a developing society to do things very differently than what the leaders of developed countries are doing. Right? There is a sort of this force sort of similarity in action, right? That the people leaders have to follow, and that I think is other part of the challenge that goes with this pandemic. A big difference I see between developed and developing societies is that there's a reasonable certainty among the citizens of developed countries in terms of what would happen to their lives, meaning the health services they have access to, right, and what they can expect from the health services. They also have some certainty, I think, great degree of certainty in terms of what will happen to their livelihoods. And so I think that's a situation where you are able to make a decision which is far more balanced and informed in some sense. While people in the developing societies, of course, always had perpetual uncertainty, just largely because they are not being as prosperous. Right? And now that is being enhanced given the situation that we are facing in developing countries. There is not as much certainty about what kind of healthcare we are going to be able to get. Right? By we, I mean the different groups of people in the society. Some of them would have better access than the others. And obviously, there is a huge uncertainty about the livelihoods. Some of us are able to survive and will survive for a longer period of time than many, many millions of people in India and similar countries. And that, I think, challenge of certainty versus uncertainty is not getting reflected also in what we have to deal with. So that's my sort of larger observation in terms of the situation in which we are making this decision about what to do. And obviously, our leaders are compelled to make those decisions. I think it is a novel virus, right? And so what is happening is that since we do not know the virology as much, of course, we are learning every day. Actually, initially, I thought, looking at the emerging evidence, that if we are able to separate the older people, since they are seem to be more affected by the virus than the younger ones. So in case of India, we can allow people below 40 to go about normal business of life if we are able to sort of separate the people above 40 and find ways of quarantining them. Yes, very difficult to do in joint families and in crowded localities where many people live. But if you're able to invest resources to think along those lines, initially I thought, given the behavior of the virus, which influences or impacts older people more, we could divide the society into buckets and be able to manage that better without having much impact on livelihoods. But in India, if you look at the data, that's not the situation. In India, we find almost 22% of the people in Maharashtra, particularly, the data that I have seen, are below the age of 40 who have died because of the virus. And so I think the understanding of Wuhan virus is still emerging, and therefore we do not really know, which is what we need to know, have some certainty about, to be able to make more reasoned judgment about what's the right action. And given that uncertainty, I think what you see happening, I think not just in India but around the world, is that each sort of political or ideological group is using this crisis to advance their own agenda. Right? So you hear a very similar argument from the left. The left believes the government's work is God's work, and so any opportunity to expand that role of state in our society is a good opportunity while it will go to waste. And obviously, the right normally feels that Leviathan grows with every crisis, and this is a major crisis, which will lead to tremendous growth in the state capacity, state powers, and we know that from history that is very difficult to unpack or unravel what the powers the state has acquired during the crisis. And therefore, you see the similar arguments from the right in terms of promoting more deregulation, less dependence on the state, unlike the left. And so I feel that in many of the ideas which are on the table are sort of circumscribed in a way by the beliefs and agenda of the various groups which they had before the virus, and largely because of the uncertainty or lack of information that we have about the virus's behavior. I think we need to be quite understanding of this uncertainty and lack of knowledge. And of course, higher always comes to your mind when you think about limitations of reason and knowledge. And in this case, obviously, it plays out even far more severely. In terms of what to do, I began thinking about.
Parth, your voice is echoing a little bit. Could you either move close to the microphone? I'm sorry.
Okay. Is it better now?
Much better. Thank you.
Thanks for pointing that out. So in terms of thinking about what we should be doing, I thought let's imagine the end state. What a normal life be like. Of course, not everything is going to be back to what it was before, but broadly define what a normal life would like. And then immediately what came to my mind is this famous statement from Adam Smith, right? It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, or the brewer, and the baker that we expect, right? And I thought one way to sort of rephrase that, that tells us about what a normal life would be like, at least for me. I am a vegetarian, so butcher doesn't really matter. So if I were able to trade with a brewer, trade with a baker, and trade with barber, you can see the hair getting longer. I would think that's a normal life, right? And that's the end sort of end goal that we have in mind, and then figure out what we do with it, right? So the life after and with Wuhan, right? How do we achieve that? I think there are three ways of achieving it. One, obviously, we have talked a lot about the herd immunity or heard many ideas around that. Second is vaccine. If you have a vaccine, and not just having a vaccine, but available to large majority of people around the globe, that obviously will provide immunity and therefore contain the impact of the virus. Vaccine obviously is under development. People say it will take about 12 to 18 months before we have one. And the third is about finding treatment for COVID-19, very similar to the treatment that we have influenza virus. These are three sort of broader ways one can think about how to begin to move toward a normal life, where we can trade with the brewer, baker, and the barber. The last two are long-term projects. Initially, we thought that the hydrochloroquine was a promising drug. Recent news in the last couple of days suggests that that's not really the case. Right? So we are left with the first option, which is herd immunity, and figuring out how to achieve that as quickly and with as little damage as possible. And here, obviously, we have two very different approaches. One, you can argue, which is sort of taken by Sweden, which has not had no lockdowns, allow people to continue with a normal life, with obviously the traditional precautions they need to take about social distancing. But social distancing is largely voluntary, and that is the way Sweden has moved. Country that people compare with is Norway, which has had a very severe lockdown and shelter-in-place policies. Initially, people thought Sweden was doing quite well and provided that model of achieving herd immunity in a shorter period of time without large number of casualties. But recently, the sort of evidence has shifted. Sweden is seeing many more COVID cases than Norway. In Norway, the curve has flattened to a large extent. In Sweden is now increasing. So again, there is no sort of clear understanding of what is the way in which to achieve herd immunity, right? And therefore, I think what we have done is social distancing, either voluntary or involuntary, and involuntary is the way which most countries have gone. India is, of course, classic example of moving into sort of long lockdown already. We already had 21-day lockdown, which is now extended for 19 more days. Now, lockdown, obviously, we know is a temporary pause. It's not going to solve the problem of the virus, right? And I think I fear that our system doesn't understand or doesn't recognize as much. The virus obviously is going to continue the moment you lift the lockdown. Is going to play havoc, right? The only thing this lockdown is trying to help is to communicate well, and which is a very important part of communicating to the diverse population with diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, levels of literacy and understanding, right? And this lockdown hopefully allows us to make that communication quite clearly, establish the protocols that people need to observe, and obviously prepare our healthcare system to deal with what's going to come next. I would have hoped that government gives more information about what they are doing, as opposed to simply requiring us to follow their dicta, right? I think it would have given a lot more confidence to the public, knowing what government is preparing in the background when we do open the lockdown. But we don't have that information in as much detail as to inspire more confidence. I think that's something we need to think about. What does governments need to do to inspire, to encourage more voluntary social distancing? That is the only way we are going to be able to get back to some form of normal life, economically as well as socially. And that I see as a great challenge in the reopening of the lockdown. Right. I have put sort of some ideas on the slide here in terms of a few thoughts on it. I don't really have much detailed understanding, frankly, to be able to give more definite answers. I do feel that the whole debate around essential industries or sectors is somewhat misguided. At some point, everything is essential, right? You cannot have drugs and testing kits being delivered unless you have transport and everything else working to make that possible, right? One idea that I think is worth thinking about is that instead of thinking about essential industries and services, you can think about a negative list, a list of industries and services that we could sort of take a pause on, to be a longer pause on those things. And that will be easier to identify and therefore build a consensus around those industries and services that people can voluntarily choose not to engage in them and can really. So having a negative list of those industries and services is, to me, looks like a better way of thinking about what can become normal and what needs to continue to have a pause. Of course, testing and tracking is going to be one of the key elements of success in the next phase. We have had, at least in India, and I'm sure it has been faced in many other countries in South Asia, a debate around the use of private labs for testing. Obviously, all of us have argued that private labs should be encouraged to test. And in many of our countries, they are far more in numbers, far more distributed across areas than the government health centers and clinics are, which have the capacity to do this kind of tests. Right? One challenge, I think, which is true in most of our countries in South Asia, is the reliability of reporting from private labs. People feel that that those with influence will get tested, and we force private labs not to report those tests, and therefore we would not be able to have a sort of more comprehensive data in terms of the extent of the effect of the virus in the country. And that remains, I think, a valid concern about private labs and how they would treat the individual data of the patient they would have. I have made some suggestions around it, that one way possibly to ensure that every test is reported in terms of whether the result is negative or positive, right? For every person who is being tested, is to simply have a sort of unique ID for every test kit, right? Basically a barcode on every test kit, so we know how many of them are there. We can track, like the Amazon tracks is every parcel, right? Where the test kits have been delivered to which labs and where they are being used. And that will be one way of, in a country as big and diverse as India is, we could have some central gathering of information that can be done by putting a barcode on every test kit. But there are, of course, challenges with that. But those are the ideas that we need to think about in terms of how we can encourage more private participation. One argument I sort of had with the new fund that PM has established, the PM CARES fund, I think that it takes away resources from local communities and civil society, which to my mind are far more effective in the last mile delivery of food, services, even information that we need to provide and gather, right? So I would urge the PM CARES fund be used exclusively to support local communities and their efforts in coping with the crisis, right? As opposed to anything that government would want to do with that fund. So the empowering local solutions and using local knowledge certainly is an important way to think about what we should be doing when we begin to relax the lockdown, right? So the normal time would have to be, and when we can trade with the brewer, baker, and the barber. I think we will think about how can we nudge and think ways in which we can encourage more voluntary social distancing. And that to me means not just to think globally and act locally, as the normal slogan says. I think we need to just keep an eye globally, but think and act locally. I see that that is really the need of the hour in terms of what we need to do. So be safe, and as they say, stay negative. So I will end sort of few observations on the, as I say, arm sharing in the times of COVID, and maybe take a few questions that we have some time for.
We're looking for questions on chat, so as soon as they come through.
So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
So the first question, Parth, is, can the media help the government? What role can the Indian media play in communicating with the people of India?
I think media obviously is one of the key channel of communication. And as you can see, government itself is trying to use media as much as possible, in sometimes not the ways we appreciate or like. I think there's a tremendous role media can play. I think there are, I don't want to name names, but there are many media houses, particularly online media sort of places, which have done a, I think, remarkable job of bringing clarity, right? Presenting opposing points of views on the situation, right? Bringing global understanding of the global sort of evidence to the people in India, right? And obviously informing people in terms of what's really going on the ground, right? I think media is, information is really a powerful tool, and we need to have as much information as possible. I think giving a context to the information is very important, because as I mentioned, it's a pandemic of experts, right? We are driven by expert opinions, and particularly those experts who are making far dire predictions and are the loudest, right? And so we need to find a balancing that part of what is also in the media, right? I think that's a role that many of us as individuals and as I think organizations, think tanks, and non-profit that we represent and work with, or including for-profit, obviously many of you are in the audience, right, can play an important role. So I do feel the wisdom of the crowd is important, and how do we use that wisdom is going to be very critical for our success. And I think would provide a great blueprint in terms of what to do in the next such crisis.
So the next question is, how long will it take India to revive from the COVID-19 effect? What are the post-pandemic situations?
As I said, this is like looking in the in the future, and it is really very difficult to say how this is going to play out. As Yazid mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of the Indian School of Public Policy, and that's a question we keep answering in terms of what we will be able to do with our first batch of scholars, and how long we'll run the classes online, what kind of engagement can be done online, right? And figuring this out just for a one simple and small 56 student sort of education institute is a huge challenge, right? So I know what I am dealing with just with that small sort of institution and small number of people who are under our care, right? I don't know what can be done, but I think as I reflected, we need to think about voluntary social distancing and not rely too long on the involuntary lockdowns, right? And I think that requires very clear communication from our leaders, from the media, from the community leaders, right? And I think that is really the way of moving forward.
The next question part is on social distancing. So there are people who cannot follow social distancing because of lack of space. What should be done by them?
I think one industry that certainly is pretty much under lockdown, and I think will remain for quite some time, right, is the hotel and restaurant industry. And the hotel, I think, particularly so, right? And maybe this is a time when they begin to bring them into use by providing space, particularly in my view, to the older people who are likely to be far more affected by this virus, right? So in a sense, allowing younger people to engage in more normal behavior, even in sort of crowded areas, if you're able to separate older people to the extent possible. I think using we also are part of the National Independent Schools Alliance, the alliance of sort of budget private schools across the country, which has more than, I think now about 60,000 members, schools across the country. And they have offered, and I think many schools have offered themselves as shelter, right? And I think we need to figure out the local spaces which are available. I think there are quite a bit of community spaces available. Some of that can also not just which is built space, like the schools, hotels, right? But also spaces that can be built temporarily, right? We have seen during tsunami and other previous crises how quickly we have been able to put up shelters, and reasonably decent shelters at that in short period of times. Our military and paramilitary forces have done that quite well, right? So I think we need to think about, expanding livable spaces, frankly, right? And thinking along those lines about what can be used, what can be built temporarily that can provide support and thereby decongest in areas, and that has to be thoughtfully targeted areas, right? Which then allows much more normal activity for the rest of the population to undertake.
Wonderful. So you talked about left and right ideologies. So there's a question on sharing some more instances of left and right ideologies at play during a pandemic like this.
So no, left believes, I'm defining left frankly as the group that believes in the idiom that government's work is God's work, right? And of course, we had to do everything possible to expand God's work, right? And therefore, I think what you see from that side is, of course, expansion of the healthcare sector, devoting more money, which is somewhat expected, reasonable demand in today's time. But also, I think we have had quite a few petitions and appeals to nationalize healthcare industry, right? And I think you can see that this is, in a sense, a very opportunistic move. In this crisis, people are unlikely to oppose that kind of a step, and therefore, I think that's a good example of how the left is not letting this crisis go to waste and furthering their agenda, right? The ideas about UBI, right, universal basic income, are again back in circulation, right? So many of the expansion of welfare state, you can say dole out to, in some cases, directly, right? So many of them make sense, right? Because you do want to help people. We know that they need help, particularly in countries like ours, where there are millions of people who are daily wage earners, millions of people who pretty much live month to month, wages they are on, right? And I think the help is needed. But I think thinking about how to provide that help in a way that doesn't then build that dependency forever. So I think left approach is largely geared towards in that way. Just to give an example, right? A conditional cash transfers, not conditional cash transfers, make a very good sense to empower people to be able to purchase. The counter argument from the left has been the cash transfers. Obviously, there are no stores are open, food is not available in many of the places. So what would you do with money, right? But you can think about how can you convert that challenge into an opportunity, right? So I can imagine, and there's a friend of mine in the US who had proposed this idea. I hope he writes about this more and quickly. So what he has proposed is that we can think of distributing PDS, the FCI go down, which are chock-full, right? Using those grains, not just through PDS shops, because that's going to be, again, limited number of shops, right? Again, you are going to create long queues outside those shops to just access those subsidized or free grains, right? So why can't we allow those grains to be distributed to any Kirana store that's willing to participate in the program, right? We would know how much grains have been given to each Kirana store, right? And to purchase those grains, right, you can distribute coupons, not really money, but you can say, I don't know, you can say FCI coupon if you want to give them the credit, or food coupons, right, to the people who need the purchasing power to go out and buy these grains, right? So you can, I think about ways in which we can meet some of these requirements without having to sort of go down the line of what many in the left are trying to propose and use this opportunity, right? And so I think that requires some thinking on our part, being a little more balanced, right? One, to be concerned about the immediate need, and that certainly cannot be denied, right? At the same time, thinking about how can you fulfill those needs, right? Without having to expand the state power and state dependency for even after the pandemic and the crisis gets over, right? One could argue, and of course, many on the left argued that right is using the same crisis to advance its own agenda, right? So deregulation certainly is a hugely talked about agenda, particularly in the healthcare sector, right? And some of the mistakes the FDA has made in the US particularly are now global examples of how the regulators have been far behind the curve, let alone help flatten the curve, right? And those are, I think, arguments. Of course, to us, it makes very good sense, frankly, that this is certainly a good time to deregulate many of the areas which have seen tighter regulations. And I think not just that, but I think it's also opening up new opportunities, a new way of thinking and doing things, just like this conference we are at, right? I mean, I certainly would have found it very odd to do this a year ago, right? Even though I'm sure we had the technology and everything in place long ago, but we never thought about using it in this particular form, right? So this large form conversation that we are able to do now from our own homes, right? Which is completely new thing, which I think is not something was taught by government regulation or a technology earlier, right? but we just came to realize the potential of this particular tool and approach. And I'm sure similar things are happening in terms of several industries, including healthcare industry, but not just healthcare, right? And therefore, I think it does open up the avenues that we should take advantage of. So I think I'm not trying to belittle the left or the right, right? I'm just trying to point out that given the uncertainty about an understanding of how virus behaves, some of these agendas also are on the table, and we need to be a little careful about aligning with one or the other. And I think it requires far more independent judgment. And I think, as I said, more balanced view and more reasoned and informed choice that we would make. And frankly, I think this is really a great training to all of us as citizens of our countries and as global citizens, right? In terms of what it takes for us to live in this new globalized world, and that world is here to stay.
Thanks, Parth. Maybe we can take one or two more questions. There's a question on commenting on the role of the WHO. In some sense, it's a global health government.
I think it is. I think I'm sure most of you have seen this piece by Yuval Harari in Financial Times, right? Where he talks about two things, right? Empowering the local communities and individuals to be able to do many of these things on their own, right? Yes, giving them information and the tools they need to be able to do those things, which is important, right? So on one end, we need to empower individuals and communities to play an impact, to play an effective role, and to be an important player in this solution to the crisis, right? At the same time, he talks about global coordination that is also required, right? And even though we may have some qualms about global government, but that's not, I think, what he means. He simply means that how do we coordinate across countries and maybe use some global organizations as a platforms, right? Not to dictate to countries what they should be doing, but a platform to be able to provide a mechanism for coordination, a platform for dialogue and larger conversations among the leaders of these countries, right? And hopefully not just leaders of political leaders of countries, but also social, economic, and other leaders who, health leaders who have a very important role to play, right? So I think I do see that Yuval's sort of argument makes sense, that we need to have global collaboration. And of course, he has given quite good examples. One can think of many such examples of why it is very critical, not just in terms of providing medicines, where you will see some collaboration, right? But also many things that we are going to need, right? Some countries are going to be ahead of the curve, some are going to be slightly behind, some are going to see the resurfacing of the virus, right? And I think being able to coordinate who needs what at a given point in time, how do we facilitate that kind of international trade and maybe bargain, right? Is very important. WHO and many of the agencies could play that role. I think, unfortunately, we are also in very divided political times, right? And each side is flexing its muscle to see how much they can influence the international organizations. Actually, I have not followed in that much detail the role of WTO and its directors and leaders, but just sort of following the common news, certainly they have disappointed, just to say it mildly, the citizens of the world in terms of their own performance. And I think we need to hold China to account. I know it's a very difficult thing to do for most countries, given the influence China now commands in the global economy. But I keep saying Wuhan virus. I've been saying it from the beginning. That's the way we have been terming every virus we had so far. There is no reason to change that. It's not to somehow blame people in Wuhan or in China, right? It's never been the case even earlier when we named Ebola virus and MERS and SARS, others by places where they started. but I think is important, and I think it's particularly important in this instance when China is not part of a larger democratic community of the world, right? Uh, yes, they are entitled to have their own political system, but as a global community, we need to recognize that there are differences between how the government in China behaves and responds and says internally and externally, right? My feeling is that, and as I think many have pointed out, there is no good sort of leader that we have in the democratic world, right? Who can command that respect and I think support from the larger democratic community, right? And that's very unfortunate, and that's I think one of the price we are paying for the polarized politics that we've had in last 5 to 10 years. One more reason to think about how to fix politics, right? In my view, I think what is wrong with the system today is not so much the economics, frankly, but it's the politics which is broken. And I think we need to figure out how to fix our politics that reflects the people's real choices and real desires and life expectations and ambitions and right what they want to achieve, what they find meaningful in their life. Right? I think we have not been able to find a political mechanism to convert those individual or group desires and expectations into a political sort of agenda, right? Either at a local level, at a city level, or a town level, or the state, or even national, obviously, certainly not at global level. So we have not found that mechanism. I think political systems have not yet delivered as I think economic system has delivered, right? So I think the coordination that is allowed by the price system, as we understand, right, by the private property and open competition, right? We know the invisible hand of the Adam Smith does work, right? With even though there are imperfections around it, but it delivers large value. It is a perfectible system. We can figure out what the flaws are, keep improving those things as we go along, right? So we don't really have any comparable political system that delivers that value, right? So even though democracy broadly is that system, but no, among the 120 democracies, each one is very differently structured and differently sort of designed. And I think we need to spend more time in fixing our politics. And I think this is a good reminder that to be able to provide that coordination at a global level that we need right kind of politics and hopefully then right kind of political leaders who emerge through that political system.
Thank you so much, Parth. This has been a great introduction. We don't have time for any more questions right now, but I'd also like to thank everybody for watching. And I'm sorry there was a little bit of a technical glitch in the beginning. We hope it won't happen again for Tyler Cowen's talk, which will start in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you, Center for Civil Society. Oh, it's also my organization and the South Asia, Students for Liberty South Asia for putting it together. I think it's a great experiment in what we can do as a community to educate, to bring different perspectives to the people. I'm very glad to be part of it.